All right, so what I want to do is walk you all through some examples of units that have a pretty strong alignment between the standards, the learning outcomes that are derived from those standards, and then the summative assessment, and some that aren't very strong. And hopefully this will help you as you prepare for your task. So the first few I'm going to share with you are some good examples, I think, and these come from students who I worked with in the middle grades program over the last year. So we worked with them on UBD and designing units backwards. And what you're going to see here are their first real attempts at being able to do that. And they're pretty great, many of them. So this first one we'll look at is the statistics unit. And let me see if this helps. All right. So in this statistics unit, the student provided the standards that she would be covering in the unit, which I'm not going to read through. You're welcome to pause the video. But you can see the standards. Students will be constructing and interpreting scatter plots. They need to know certain things. So within the standards, sometimes the standards will have language that's written as a skill. So this is a skill-based to be able to construct and interpret something. And also some that are just discrete types of knowledge students need to know. They need to know that straight lines are used to model relationships and etc. Okay, so here are all of the different standards. And then what she did was she didn't just take these standards as the end-all be-all. Then she unpacked them into, okay, so in order for students to be able to master, for example, this standard, what do they need to know, understand, and be able to do? And so she did that for the standards as a whole here. So students will understand that organizing data is essential, defining patterns, etc. Again, you can pause this, I'm not going to read them. What students will need to be able to know and what students will need to be able to do at the end of the unit. So there's a lot in here. Then this was a 10-day unit, so I'm not going to share the whole unit with you, but she broke down in each day. She had formative assessments and instructional tasks that had students practicing some of these learning outcomes each day. So they were kind of paced throughout. Okay, her final assessment had two parts. This was all going on during the Olympics. It was this past spring. So for her first part of her summative assessment, she gave them a traditional test where they had to interpret graphs, explain why a line was a certain way, describe the different relationship between variables because it was a statistics unit. So a very traditional sort of test, but also she had them do this for their summative. So for part 2, they constructed tables and scatter plots for Olympic events based off of provided data sheets. So she gave them sheets that had all kinds of data about, if it was like cross-country skiing, what were the different times and distances for each of the different events, things like that. So the students got to choose 2 events. One would be a women's and one would be a men's sport. They constructed a table for each event to organize their data, and they had to include these things. They constructed a scatter plot, again, for each of the sports that's going to show us the relationship between the variables they were looking at. Then they had to, this is assessing their understanding. They had to determine what kind of association exists for their scatter plots and why does your graph have that association. And then predict what time the gold medal winner may hit the Olympics that year. So in this, that's really nice because this final assessment is going to show us what students know, what they're able to do, and really what their big understandings are as it relates to statistics. So this was a nice summative task for students. All right, let's look at a science one. This one, they were studying, oh, that's really tiny. Let's go up here. All right. All right, so for this one, they were studying solutions. This was physical science, 8th grade. And so here you can see the standards that they have to be able to obtain, evaluate, and communicate information to explain the property of solutions. And a lot of the standards that you'll see that are written for science are skill-based. So you can even just look at the verbs here: develop and use, plan and carry out, analyze and interpret. A lot of that is what students are able to do. So that's the thing about when we unpack standards. In order to, let's just use this one as an example, in order to develop and use models to explain the properties of solutions, students can't do that unless they already know what a solute is, what a solvent is, what conductivity is, what concentration is, how you determine concentration. So you can't just take a standard as a given. You have to unpack it. And in order for students to even be able to do this, they have to know these things first. So she took all of these standards and she broke them down. So first she had her large understandings, that, for example, the property of the substances in a solution determine the properties of the solution itself. And there's a large understanding that solutions of various pH are used frequently in our everyday lives, and etc. Here's where she breaks down, here are some of the discrete things students will need to know, like that example we just gave, that they need to know that a solvent is a substance that dissolves in another substance. They have to know that before they can even master that previous standard. Here are the things in the unit that students will be able to do. And so again, just like in the previous example I gave you, throughout her unit, she had tasks and formative assessments all along the way that gave students opportunities to practice these outcomes, and also gave her information as the instructor with formative assessments about whether they were able to do this and what she would need to tweak. All right, here was her summative task. Oh, I have it here because that's kind of messy looking. All right, so her final project, she had students choose a solution that's common in everyday life. So this is really nice because what she's doing is it's that whole thing that, who talked about this last week? I think it was Wiggins and McTighe. The transference of learning and understanding, that if you really understand a concept, you're able to apply that concept across new applications. So here, they're taking something they've been learning about in their class and they're applying it to a new applications by looking at some sort of everyday solution that they see. And here are some examples of solutions they could have picked. What she had them do was they had to identify the solute and solvent. Then they had to compare and contrast the properties of the solute, solvent, and the solution themselves. So this is kind of a higher order thinking task. They had to test and describe how temperature and agitation affect the rate of dissolution of their solution. So here they're actually performing some sort of task with it, some sort of experiment. And then they had to attempt to find and measure the saturation point of their solution. So this, and then they could present their information in lots of different ways. So this was her attempt to differentiate the final product, which is what Wormley talks about in the chapter you read about for this module, is differentiation. So again, this is a really nice summative task that is assessing a lot of the core learning outcomes that she had identified, which were derived from the standards. Okay. I am going to show you an example of an ELA example from some tests that I created when I was a teacher. So these are old, and let's see, 2008, like that's crazy. And so I don't have my whole unit here for you to look at, but basically this unit was characterization. So if I had selected standards that you'd be looking at, a lot of them would be about not just understanding how authors create character, but also how to provide evidence, how to cite evidence from text to support your inferences, all of those sorts of things. So I started giving my students tests in addition to some other performance tasks because I wanted to see that they were able to apply the reading and writing standards that I was really focusing on, that they could apply that in new contexts. So instead of, for example, of me testing them on some story we had already read when we were studying character, I gave them a new text to read on the test to see could they transfer their understandings and their skills and what they know to a new context. So I'll show you two examples. This one is characterization, and so first I'm just asking them to identify, this is like, what do students need to know? They need to know the 5 types of characterization. So here they would identify them. And then I had them apply it by reading a new text. So the text they read for the test was the No Guitar Blues. And so I had them complete this. So what does this paragraph tell you about the character? So what I ended up doing was, in the short story, I would have symbols in the story that told them to stop and go to number 6 on the test. So that I was kind of testing, like, as a reader, as you're reading, what kind of inferences are you making about the character right now in the text? How do you know? So they had to provide evidence from the text to support whatever it was they were thinking about the character. And then what kind of characterization did the author use to achieve this? And so I did that throughout the short story. And then finally, they needed to write, how did the character change throughout the story? Because we were looking at dynamic characters. And again, they had to use details to support their inference and other stuff. They had another question like that. Another example was a metaphor and simile test. So this is another example of giving students new here we go. Giving them opportunities to first I just wanted them to define the concepts that we had been studying, and I told them they could provide examples if they need to. Here I just wanted to see, like, what do you know and understand about these concepts? Then for the rest of the test, I had them applying their knowledge and their skills to new texts. So first I had them create metaphors or similes, and they didn't just create a metaphor or simile. I think a lot of times I see teachers do that, like write a simile about the weather. So just because students can say it was hot like a burning fire doesn't mean they really understand why a simile is a powerful tool for authors. So here I wanted them to explain why they chose what they chose when they were writing their metaphor or simile. Then I gave them some passages that included metaphor or simile, and first they had to just do some identification of where the metaphor and simile were in the passage, but then they had to talk about what does the simile and metaphor suggest about the characters. So that's the part I often see teachers miss when they're teaching an ELA, when they're teaching things like figurative language. A lot of times it's just identification. Identify the imagery. Where do we see the author using sound? But like the more important part is, like, why did the author use that? What choices was the author making, and how did that affect the meaning, the tone of the text? So I ask my students to do a lot of that sort of stuff when they are performing a test. All right, let's look at some not so hot examples of teachers identifying standards, unpacking them, and then coming up with assessments that don't really align with that. So here's an example from a student from last semester where, all right, so the standard that she was going to be focusing on for this unit was to analyze continuity and change in Southern and Eastern Asia. And some of the subsections of that standard are to describe the impact of Gandhi's belief in nonviolent protest. So implicit in this, I believe, is the idea that the impact should be on Southern and Eastern Asia as well as the rest of the world. But this is a world at 7th grade social studies, so they are studying world cultures and world history. And then how nationalism led to independence in India. So these are the standards she's covering, and she's broken that out. She wants students to understand Gandhi's significance, to understand that nationalism and his advocacy of political independence, etc. They need to know some particular things. They needed to be able to do some particular things in order to meet the standard. Okay, so here was the summative assessment that she originally came up with. So throughout the week, we've been learning about Gandhi, his role in India's independence, his nonviolent forms of protest, and how we see nonviolent protest in our world. Today, I'd like you to reflect on these questions. What can Gandhi teach today's protesters? What can we learn from him? What does nonviolent protest get us? All right, so as a side note, I want to say that one thing I love about what the student did was she really did bring in a lot of different examples of nonviolent protest today. I think she talked about like the taking the knee at the national anthem to protest police brutality, like lots of different examples of how this is happening in today's world, because she wanted to make the text and the ideas relevant to her students. So I like that. The thing is that, so then she had them pick two of the questions and write an essay explaining their stance, and then a visual representation. So the thing about it is that what got lost in this is that really this standard is about Gandhi's impact on India and on the nationalist movement. So I could see her using some of these questions as part of her final assessment, but her summative assessment really did not get at basically the majority of the learning outcomes that she had identified, nor the actual standard. She did go back and add this question: how did his belief in nonviolent protest impact India? I still don't think that's totally hitting the mark that we need for this. So this is a good example of a teacher in very good faith trying to come up with an assessment that's going to engage students, be relevant to them, but actually sort of in doing that too much misses the mark of what they really wanted to assess to begin with. It's a really easy thing to do. All right, here's an example from the Read, Write, Think website, which I actually really love. They have a ton of lesson plans and unit plans that teachers can look at. You can look them up by going to Classroom Resources. So here I found a unit plan. Let me see if I can make this bigger for you guys. Yeah, it's not like that great. Sorry about that. Okay, so this is a unit plan called Analyzing, whoa, now you can't see anything. Okay, Analyzing How Narrative Structure Generates Empathy and Wonder. So the book is Wonder, and clearly they want us to be looking at narrative structure and analyzing narrative structure and how it generates empathy. So here are the standards. Now the thing about it is these standards are just general literacy standards based on the National Council of Teachers of English. So these are not Common Core standards. So just like students will read a lot of different types of text, they'll read a wide range of language or literature, they'll apply a wide range of strategies to comprehend texts and to write about texts. If we had been looking at Common Core standards for this, we would be including, again, keeping in mind that the whole purpose of this is to analyze narrative structure, we would have selected some text. I think I have some. Where are my Common Core? I don't really need to go through all this with you guys. You looked at the Common Core standards. You know that they're about really citing evidence from text, analyzing the text using evidence, being able to cite the text, making inferences, all of that stuff. All right, I'm going to go to the instructional plan. And in the instructional plan, they start with their objectives. Their students will define and distinguish sympathy, empathy, and compassion, describe characters based on information given by a character who's not that character, refine understanding of a character once they read their point of view, explain how their understanding changed in an informal letter, and apply their understanding of these concepts. So here's something tricky that I see a lot of times, and especially English language arts, is our standards are applicable across like almost any text, you know, because it's like being able to read and write, and you can do that with any text. So sometimes teachers, you know, we create these units that are based on concepts, like in this case, empathy. And our unit then is driven by empathy, understanding empathy, and not text-based. Not sure if I'm explaining that very well. But you can even see in their objectives here that there are very little objectives here about what students need to be able to do and understand as it comes to reading and writing. Now let me show you their final assessment. I think I pulled this up already. Okay, so after the novels, you want them to think about which characters, blah, blah. Here it is, assign and discuss the letter assignment rubric. So here's their final assignment. Keeping in mind that the purpose was to analyze how narratives construct characters. Choose one of the secondary characters from the text and write a letter to him or her explaining how your feelings and opinions towards him or her changed over the course of the book. In your letter, be sure to focus on key actions and statements that you were able to interpret differently once you had information from their perspective. Make sure you use the concepts of sympathy, empathy, and compassion. So look here at this, the rubric. So the rubric, I don't know, I just feel like this is an example where they don't really, like, I'm not sure that students were really able to analyze how a narrative constructed a character based on this particular summative assessment. I think there are other things that the teachers could have done in order to figure that out, and I just don't think this is a very strong example. Another example I will show you. So in the Wormley, this is the last one, I promise. Oh my gosh. I can't stand just talking on and on and on, you guys. I would never do this in a real class. Not that this isn't a real class, you know what I mean, face to face. Okay. Wormley talks about differentiating your units and your summative assessments. This is another ELA example from one of my students who was attempting to do that. So she created a tic-tac-toe board, which is a way of giving students choice in how they want to show their learning. So the standards that she selected was for students to be able to cite textual evidence that supports their analysis of the text, determining theme, looking at different lines of dialogue to see how it propelled the action, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to go through all this with you. Really just want to show you the tic-tac-toe board. And in doing this, I need to make this smaller so you can see the whole thing. Okay, I'm sorry, you probably can't see this very well. So here's one of the things about this is if you're going to create something where it's a differentiated tasks, you want to make sure that, and Wormley talks about this, you're still assessing the same learning outcomes. Students are just demonstrating them in different ways. So here's what's a little tricky. Like if we look at plot here she has, I'm just going to look at this one. Don't worry, I'm not going to analyze the whole thing. She has students making a picture book representation of everyday use. That's a short story. Making sure to pull quotes that they think are relevant to the story. So one question I would have here is, how does making a picture book demonstrate students' understanding of plot? So you'd really want to make sure that this picture book is showing exposition, summarizing action, the climax, the denouement, etc. So making sure they're using quotes that demonstrate that, I guess. So here I could see how students could possibly do this and really just have like the most exciting parts of the text, which doesn't really necessarily align with plot. Look at this one. Rewrite the story using a more modern setting. What might be the modern equivalent of the quilt? So here, this has nothing actually to do with plot. This is assessing how setting impacts story or theme, and that's not related here. So a lot of her tic-tac-toe board actually does work, but I wanted to show you how you just have to be really mindful when you're creating your tasks, especially if they're differentiated, to make sure that all of them are meeting the same learning outcomes, just that they're showing them in different ways. And OMG, I'm going to stop talking now. If you got to the end, congratulations.